This video is about a problem that all civilizations have to face, which is the problem of private or hidden information. The prisoner's dilemma does not involve hidden information, but it will be our entry point for this discussion. So if you don't know the prisoner's dilemma, here's how it works. The police have captured 2 bank robbers, but they don't have enough evidence to get a conviction. So what they do is they separate the 2 prisoners and they offer each of them the same deal. Confess to robbing the bank and we'll let you off scot-free and send your partner to prison for 20 years. And keep in mind that he's getting the same deal, so if you refuse to rat him out, he'll probably rat you out and you'll go to jail for 20 years while he goes scot-free. And if they both confess, then they each go to prison for 12 years. And what happens if they both refuse to rat out their partner? Well, the police do have enough evidence to get them for a lesser crime, like, say, evading the police. So in that scenario, they each go to jail for 2 years. So, for the prisoners collectively, their best outcome is when they both refuse to rat out their partner. Then they only go to jail for 2 years each, or a total of 4 years in prison. However, the logic of the game says that no matter what the other prisoner does, your best option is to defect. If the other guy chooses not to rat you out, then you go away scot-free. And if he does choose to rat you out, you're still better off if you choose to rat him out, because you're better off going to prison for 12 years than for 20 years. So that's the scenario. The best option for the group is if they both cooperate, but the best option for each individual is to defect. So in game theory terms, the prisoner's dilemma has a single Nash equilibrium of always defect. And if you watched the previous video on Populist Conservatism number 8, then the prisoner's dilemma is just a 2-player version of the tragedy of the commons. In both cases, there's a single Nash equilibrium of always defect. And this is very common in groups. Everybody, I'm sure, has been in either a work-related group or a school-related group where some people are free riders and don't work very hard and everybody else gets frustrated by it. So it's in the nature of groups that the group does better if everyone works hard, but it's in the incentive of each individual to coast or slack or shirk on the efforts of everyone else. So, why am I going through all this work on the prisoner's dilemma when I've already introduced the tragedy of the commons in a previous video? And the answer is that the prisoner's dilemma does have a relatively straightforward solution, and that solution is tit-for-tat. Now, tit-for-tat only works in what's called an iterated prisoner's dilemma, and that's when you play the prisoner's dilemma over and over and over again. And the idea is that it does allow us to model real-world cooperation more effectively. Sometimes we do have one-shot deals, but cooperation is usually an ongoing process. And ongoing processes allow us to get information from your partner's past behavior. So in that sense, it also models real-world interactions better than a one-shot prisoner's dilemma. And the social scientist Robert Axelrod hosted a famous tournament, and basically what he did is he just invited a whole bunch of social scientists to create their own computer strategy for playing the prisoner's dilemma. And they could come up with whatever strategy they want. It could be always defect, it could be always cooperate, it could be some sly strategy that would defect in certain conditions and cooperate in certain conditions. And all these different strategies went and played each other, and it turns out that the winner was tit-for-tat. And Robert Axelrod has done variations of this tournament, and as a general rule, tit-for-tat usually wins. It doesn't always win, and there are some strategies that can beat tit-for-tat, but for the most part, if you host one of these tournaments, you can count on the fact that tit-for-tat will either win or do very well. And the reason why tit-for-tat does so well is it's got 3 very commendable virtues. The first virtue is that it's nice. It always starts out by cooperating. So in the first round of an iterated prisoner's dilemma, it will cooperate. So the highest payouts come from cooperation. So prisoner's dilemma is nice, it tries to reach cooperative outcomes. The second virtue of tit-for-tat is that it is street smart. So after that first round, what it does is copies your previous move. So if you cooperate, then it'll just keep on cooperating. But if you defect, then tit-for-tat will defect in its next round to punish you. And what this does is it prevents tit-for-tat from being taken advantage of. Some of the strategies in Robert Axelrod's tournament were very sly and sneaky, and they could take advantage of sort of a naive do-gooder strategy. But tit-for-tat is street smart enough that it avoids being taken advantage of. And its third virtue is that it's forgiving, so it only has a memory of a single round. So maybe some really sneaky, evil strategy tries to defect 20 rounds in a row, and then it says, okay, fine, this isn't going anywhere, so I'm going to try and cooperate now. Well, tit-for-tat will forget all the past defections and immediately cooperate on its next round. So tit-for-tat is not like the Hatfields and the McCoys. It doesn't hold this long grudge. It's very forgiving. And that keeps it from being stuck in long drawn-out wars with other opponents. Now, if you watch YouTube videos on tit-for-tat, or if you just read more sophisticated works of social science on tit-for-tat, they almost always draw the wrong conclusion. And that conclusion is that cooperation is in our rational self-interest. And that is not true. And the reason why it's not true is because tit-for-tat is a game with only 2 players and perfect information. So this is like a bit that Bill Cosby had. He once asked the audience to raise their hand if they were parents with only 1 child. And he said that they weren't really even parents yet because they only had 1 child. And the reason why is because if someone did something wrong, they know who did it. It's only parents with 2 or more children run into the problem that if there's a broken vase, you no longer know which of your kids did it. And that same reasoning applies to tit-for-tat. If someone in the game defects, you know who did it. It was the other guy, and you know exactly who to punish. But what if there aren't 2 players? What if there are 10 players? What if there are 2,000 players? What if, instead of talking about 2 prisoners arrested by the police, we're talking about a small village that makes its living by fishing, and in order to prevent this village from overfishing their local habitat, they all follow an informal quota. Except 600 people are no longer following this quota, and they're taking more than their fair share. How do you punish them? You don't even know which of the 600 people are breaking their quota. You just know that a bunch of people are breaking it. And that is a much, much harder problem to solve than the 2-player prisoner dilemma. And the social science backs this up. There's a famous theorem in social sciences called the Folk Theorem. And the Folk Theorem basically says that in repeated games with a small number of players and perfect information, then you've got a very good chance of reaching cooperative outcomes. But in large games with large numbers of players and imperfect information, you're not very likely to reach a cooperative outcome. And the economist Herb Gintis reviews the literature on the Folk Theorem in his book, The Bounds of Reason, and that's exactly what he finds empirically. Cooperation does tend to happen quite often for small groups, but not very often for large anonymous groups. And the political scientist Elinor Ostrom is one of the rare non-economists to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. And what she did is studied the conditions that had to be true in order for groups like, say, our village that makes the living by fishing, what these groups had to do in order to achieve cooperative outcomes. And we'll get to that in a later video. We've just got more fundamentals to cover before we get there. This video is going to be a deeper dive in the problem of hidden information, and hopefully now you understand why that's a major problem. So, that takes us to the next parable in our tour of economics, and this parable is the market for lemons, or the market for used cars. It was devised by George Akerlof, and he won the 2001 Nobel Prize for this concept. Now, used cars are a very humble topic, but you'll see that it has vast and far-reaching implications. And the way it works is this. We could divide cars into 2 categories. Peaches are good cars that run really well, and lemons are bad cars that have a lot of problems. And let's say that peaches are worth $24,000 and lemons are worth $16,000. And let's also say that half the cars are peaches and half the cars are lemons. So think about the car market from the perspective of a buyer. If you're a buyer, you don't know if the car you're about to buy is a peach or a lemon. That's hidden information that you do not have. So, if half the cars are peaches and half the cars are lemons, you would be willing to pay $20,000 for a used car. If it's a peach, you come out a little bit ahead. If it's a lemon, you come out a little bit behind, but it is a fair bet. But the owner of the car is in a very different situation because he does know the hidden information. he does know that his car is either a peach or a lemon. And suppose the car is a peach. An owner is not going to sell a car that he knows is worth $24,000 for only $20,000. So owners would refuse to sell peaches. And so what this means is that the free market cannot provide the service of selling high-quality used cars. The free market can only sell used cars that are lemons. And so the market would very quickly turn into one where only lemons that are worth $16,000 are sold. I said the market for lemons has vast and far-reaching implications, and here's a couple examples. Suppose you're getting married and you want to know if your spouse is a peach or a lemon. They may have been on their best behavior while you were dating, but sooner or later, unfortunately, you're going to find out the hidden information that your spouse has. And it's a sad fact of life that many people thought they were marrying a peach, only to find out that they married a lemon. The same thing is true for employers at firms. When you're trying to hire a candidate for a new job, you don't know if your candidate is a peach or a lemon. And let's bring this back to the prisoner's dilemma. So the mafia also has a problem of bringing people into their organized crime networks. They want peaches, people who will not rat out the organization if they happen to get arrested. So the mafia also has to try and separate peaches from lemons. And that's also why organized crime often runs on family ties. The close-knit relationships in families help foster cooperation. So someone might be a lemon. They might cheerfully rat out their partner if they weren't related, but they wouldn't rat out their brother in a crime, particularly knowing that their father and their uncles and their other brothers would all know about how they behave. So family ties can overcome part of this problem. The real challenge is learning how to cooperate outside of the family, and that's going to be a major running theme throughout this video series. But for now, let's continue to focus on the problem of hidden information. And ironically, one of the places where hidden information is not a problem is in the market for used cars. So there's a whole bunch of ways that markets can adapt to solve the problem of hidden information. Dealers do have the ability to assess a car's quality, and they can offer warranties on certified used cars. And there are other services like Carfax and AutoCheck that allow consumers without technical ability to gain information about a car's condition. And this is a pattern that we've seen over and over again already in this series. And the pattern is that the left sees a departure from the theoretical ideal of perfect competition, and based on that, they believe that there's a market failure and therefore government interference is justified. So we saw it with the market frictions that led to minimum wage laws, and those were covered in Populist Conservatism number 3, the case for free markets. Another example is network monopolies, which were discussed in Populist Conservatism number 5 on monopolies. And in that case, the Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Krugman has an entire chapter in his book, Peddling Prosperity, which he calls The Economics of QWERTY. And the idea is that we are trapped into inefficient keyboards because of a market failure, when in fact the modern ergonomics research shows that the cost of switching does not justify the slight gains of efficiency by using a different keyboard. And there's a couple other classic examples from the economics literature that you should be familiar with. One of them is lighthouses, and lighthouses were considered to be a public good, much like national defense and roads, and that if everybody chips in, you get the benefit of a lighthouse, but it's in the self-interest of each individual person to free ride and not contribute, and so therefore the government was required to fund lighthouses. And the economist Paul Samuelson was one of the leading and most influential economists in the 1950s and 60s, and his famous textbook Economics used this as an example of a market failure. And Paul Samuelson, by the way, was the mentor to Paul Krugman. However, the famous libertarian economist Ronald Coase showed that this was not true, and that 18th century Britain had financed lighthouses by having ports charge each ship a small docking fee, which was used to fund the construction and maintenance of lighthouses. And yet another example that's been important is the idea of bee pollination. Now, bee pollination is essential to many types of farming, but there's no way for people to control where bees go, or at least that's what economists used to think. And therefore, bee pollination was a market failure. However, in a famous article called The Fable of the Bees, the economist Stephen Chung showed that beekeepers and farmers would contract with each other, so the farmers would pay beekeepers a certain amount of money to set up hives near their fields. And so the lesson, as always, is the mere fact that a market departs from some theoretical ideal of perfection doesn't mean that you actually have a meaningful market failure. And entrepreneurs who have skin in the game are extremely creative about finding solutions that get around these supposed roadblocks. And so once again, the lesson is that free markets are defended not because they meet some theoretical ideal of perfection, but because windfall profits are an incentive to innovate. To choose a really boring example, suppose a firm learns how to make mattresses for half the price of other companies. So they'll undercut all their rivals in order to grab market share while still reaping windfall profits due to their much lower costs. But other companies aren't going to sit around and let this happen. They're going to try and reverse engineer whatever their technology is, and pretty soon they'll be doing the same thing too. So for example, in the auto industry, American firms copied the lean manufacturing techniques that the Japanese firms invented. And then, once all their rivals start copying them, then they can't undercut them for the sake of grabbing market share. Competition will just drive down the prices lower and lower until it's down to the cost of production. So in the short term, the innovative firm is the winner with windfall profits, and they should be the winner. That's the incentive to get them to innovate. But in the long run, the consumers are the real winners because of the lower prices. So once again, the economist George Stigler is proven right. Competition is a hardy weed, not a delicate flower. So, the market for lemons is not really a factor when it comes to free markets, but it does remain a factor when it comes to people, whether you're choosing a spouse or whether you're a firm looking to hire a new employee. So let's think through the parable a little bit more. The main problem is that the owner of a car that is a peach can't just say, "Hey, my car's a peach," because there's no reason to trust him. An owner of a lemon could just as easily lie and say that their car is a peach, and there's literally nothing that the prospective buyer can do about it. And so that sets up the key challenge. How can the owner of a car that's a peach communicate their hidden information to the prospective buyer in a way that the owner of a lemon can't fake? And this is where the concept of signals enters the story. The movie The Sixth Sense was about a boy who could see ghosts, and the catchphrase of the movie was, "I see dead people. They're everywhere. They don't even know they're dead." And economists have their own version of this. "I see people signaling. They're everywhere. They don't even know they're signaling." Signals are how we share hidden information with others. And the key thing about signals is that people who are peaches can give the signal, but people who are lemons cannot fake it. And so when you see the signal, you can trust it. Peacocks are a textbook example of signaling. Female peahens face the exact same problem that a car buyer faces. They don't know if a male is a peach or a lemon. A peach is a male with good genes, and a lemon is a male with bad genes. And the females want to choose a male with good genes so that her own offspring will have the best chance possible of surviving in the wild. So male peacocks signal their fitness to females with their tail. Females will choose the male with the largest, most beautiful tail. And gazelles signal their fitness to cheetahs by stotting, which is jumping in the air. If you've ever seen a nature documentary, you've probably seen how some of the gazelles will just take this long, arching leap through the air in the middle of the chase. You'd wonder why they might do that. It seems like a very risky thing to do, and it burns a lot of energy compared to just running. But it's a signal, and cheetahs will often stop chasing gazelles that stot. And if you've ever played tag as a child, you've probably learned the same lesson. Don't chase the kid who takes a lot of seemingly dumb risks, because he's the neighborhood fast kid and you're never going to catch him. Good signals have two important qualities. The first is that they are costly, and the second is that they have a high broadcast efficiency. And a peacock's tail does both. So it's got a high broadcast efficiency because it's very big and beautiful, and it's hard to miss that peacock's tail when he unfurls it. And it's also costly. It's what biologists call a handicap. And the cost of a signal is very important. That's the main reason why lemons can't fake a signal, is because lemons can't afford to pay the cost. So a physically fit peacock can drag around their big beautiful tail through the wilderness all year and they can survive just fine. but a weak, scrawny peacock that's struggling to survive won't have the energy or the strength to do it. Advertising is an example of a signal that meets both qualities. A firm that sells widgets is in the exact same position as a person selling a used car. Consumers have no idea if the firm's widgets are a peach or a lemon, but the firm itself has a very good idea. The engineers that designed it would know it quite intimately, and the firm can do market research and focus group testing to see how consumers would react. And so the question is, how can firms tell consumers that their product is really good? And the answer to that question is with a costly signal, namely advertising. So leftists have a long tradition of hating advertising. Marxists would argue that advertising creates false needs and a false consciousness, and the critical theorists like Marcuse took this idea even farther. And even more pragmatically minded leftists would say that advertising is not a case of the invisible hand informing consumers, but rather consumers being manipulated into buying stuff they don't need. Now, these critics are 100% correct that advertising is uninformative, but signaling explains why. Talk is cheap. Any firm can say, our widgets are the best, they make the tastiest coffee, and they clean the toughest spills. But only a foolish consumer would actually believe what a firm has to say. What matters is not the content of the advertising, but how much money the firm spends. Talk is cheap, but money talks. It doesn't make sense for a firm to spend millions of dollars advertising a product that it knows is a lemon. People will buy it once and then never again. And they'll go on to Facebook and Twitter/X and complain about how bad the product is. So that's not a good use of a firm's money. A firm should only spend money on a product if they think it's going to be a success. And in that case, the only thing that matters is that a firm does what they can to increase the broadcast efficiency of their signal. And that means making commercials that are funny or creative or sexy so that consumers will notice it and be aware of how much money the firm is spending on their advertising campaign. And now let's think about the problem of choosing a good spouse. People want to marry someone who's a peach and avoid the lemons, and abstinence is a signal of being a peach. These days, TikTok is filled with shorts of women complaining about men who promise them the world and talk about how unique they are and how she's the exact right kind of woman that he's looking for, and then after they have sex, he ghosts her and she never hears from him again. Abstinence is a costly signal that a man views a woman as a long-term partner and not a short-term hookup. It's costly because people like sex, and it has a high broadcast efficiency, at least to the woman he's dating. Signals also help with the problem of firms trying to hire good employees. Getting a college education is a signal of both intelligence and your work ethic. The left does not understand signaling, so they've seen how people with college degrees make more money as a group than people who don't have college degrees, and so they have been pushing to get more and more people into college, even while they dumb down colleges in order to do this. And we've seen this with grade inflation as well as declining study time by college students. So a 2011 time use study by Babcock and Marks found that in 1961, college students studied 24 hours a week compared to just 14 hours a week in 2003. And that average has probably gone down even more since 2003. And the outcome of this is credential inflation. If you dumb down college so that you don't have to be as intelligent or conscientious and hardworking to graduate from college, then the signal is also not as strong of a signal. And that's how you get credential inflation. Jobs that used to require a high school degree now require college. Jobs that require college now require some sort of a postgraduate degree. However, dumbing down education doesn't make it any less expensive. So young people are getting hit in two different ways. First, they have to spend more time in school and accumulate more student loan debt. And second, each year in school costs them 1 year of working, so they're making less money in order to pay off those loans. So suppose Alicia goes on to get her master's degree in a career where a college degree used to be acceptable. She'll spend 2 years getting her master's and accumulate another $120,000 in student loan debt, and she'll lose out on 2 years of earning. And this point is important. She doesn't miss out on the first 2 years of work. She's going to have those first 2 years of work no matter what. What she's missing out on is her last 2 years of work. So her inflation-adjusted salary in her last 2 years of work might be $120,000. So credential inflation takes $360,000 out of her pocket. $120,000 for the debt and $240,000 of lost wages. So, signals have a lot of power in terms of their ability to share hidden information. But they also have a major downside, which is sometimes we care more about the signal itself than whatever fundamental trait it's signaling. And we even have an expression for that. Perception is more important than reality. A classic example of this is Hitler's winter blunder. He invaded Russia in June and expected an easy victory just like he had in France. However, he made slow progress, and by autumn it had become clear that it would take at least into the winter. And yet Hitler refused to order winter clothing for his soldiers, which resulted in many of them either getting frostbite or dying because of cold exposure. It wasn't until late December that Hitler finally ordered the winter clothing. So why did Hitler make this mistake? Because ordering winter gear would act as a signal. It would reveal the hidden information that the war was not going well. So his propaganda couldn't lie and say that victory with Russia would happen any day now if he was ordering winter clothing and settling in for the long haul. So I hate to say anything nice about the second most abhorrent government that ever existed, but the Soviet Union would take advantage of Hitler's mistake, and they would go on to do the real lion's share of defeating the Nazis in World War II. Capitalist firms do the exact same thing. They find ways to signal that they are strong, even though they have hidden information that they are weak. So they can do this in a variety of ways, such as income smoothing, deferring expenses, and cutting research and development. This allows a weak firm to hit their quarterly earnings forecast, which should, in theory, be a strong signal of a firm's underlying health. But in the case of the weak firm, it's not. It's a deceptive signal. So if you've ever worked for a firm that refused to pull the plug on what everyone knew was a failing project, it's not because management is incompetent. It's rather because management could either report that their new project will start earning returns of $100 million a year, or they can pull the plug and write down the project as $1 billion loss. Since the stock options of CEOs and senior management only have value if the firm's stock price goes up, this is an easy call to make. Now, in theory, audits and accounting standards are supposed to prevent this kind of shady behavior, but in practice there's a lot of gray area, and smart CEOs know how to make a lot of money in the gray areas of life. And the next 2 videos in this series will be a deep dive on exactly this phenomenon, because firms are really one of the most important areas where you need groups of people to cooperate. So earlier in this video I used the example of what happens if you've got a small village that makes their living as fishermen and some people aren't following their informal quota. But the most important example is what if you have a 2,000 person firm and 600 of the people are shirking on the job? And that's really what the next couple videos are about. In theory, luxury goods are a classic example of signaling. And some luxury goods do succeed in doing that. Only someone who's truly wealthy can afford to buy a 200-foot yacht. But these days, luxury goods are used for deceptive signaling. So you've got a lot of people who are living paycheck to paycheck, and yet they drive fancy cars and own high-end luxury goods and live in a big house. So they look rich and they signal wealth despite the fact that they're in debt and financially underwater. And people who actually are rich are well aware of this phenomenon, so no one who actually was rich would be caught dead with like a Prada handbag or Louis Vuitton or one of these obvious markers of wealth. And the TV show Succession, which features a billionaire family, is a good case study on that. They wear brands like Loro Piana and Brunello Cucinelli. And the thing about these brands is they don't have big logos like the way Prada and Louis Vuitton do. They really don't have logos at all. And to me, as a normie, they look just like J.Crew or Talbot's or some other respectable middle-class store. But to people in that world, they're extremely different. So they obviously use much higher quality materials. So instead of just regular high-end cashmere, they would use baby cashmere from the first molting of a baby goat. And there's many other small differences, like double cashmere with invisible seams, and rolled shoulders, and horn buttons, and 1,000 other micro differences that signal quality. And so the people living in this world learn to recognize these small markers of high quality craftsmanship. So they wouldn't necessarily know that a woman is wearing a Loro Piana outfit, but they would be able to tell from the craftsmanship that she belongs to their world of quiet luxury. And so I don't really care about the fashion world, but what I'm hoping that you're taking from this is just how people start to care so much more about the signal than the thing that they're actually signaling, and how signaling turns into this giant game that people play. And so signals started out as a way to share hidden information. They're supposed to make the world more efficient by solving the market for lemons, but they turn into this very expensive and counterproductive game. And sometimes signals do succeed in conveying private information and then still fail. So, for example, a character from Succession wouldn't be impressed by someone who's new money carrying around the really obvious luxury goods like Prada. All they signaled was that they don't know how to play the game. And although we haven't reached this point in the video series yet, eventually I'll start dropping some Jane Austen references, and that's not going to impress someone who has a real deep love for literature. So I might signal a certain middle-brow sophistication with knowledge of Jane Austen, but it also signals the lack of fortitude and desire to read more challenging books. But my favorite example of this phenomenon comes from Samuel Johnson's Lives of the Poets, and I learned about this from the historian Robert Buchholz. In the late 1600s, the poet and diplomat Matthew Prior was given a tour of the magnificent palace of Versailles, and it was built by Louis XIV, the Sun King, and he made a brief appearance in Populist Conservatism #1. And for much of European history, kings could only raise money by entering into a negotiation with a body like Parliament in England or the Estates General in France. But King Louis XIV had become an absolute monarch with the power to tax, and Louis XIV used this power to basically bleed his peasants dry and then build the magnificent Palace of Versailles. And if you read about the Palace of Versailles today in history books or on websites about it, it's usually presented as a monument to French decadence. And like any conservative, I'm as quick to criticize French decadence as anyone, but that's not really what was going on with King Louis. He built that palace to be a threat. He built it to be a show of force. He built it to show to everyone else in the world just how rich France was. So visiting dignitaries and nobility would come by, they'd be given a tour of the palace, and then they'd report home that war with France would be complete suicide. Even in the early modern era of history, wars were won as much by money as they were by guns. And just like how people who can't afford luxury goods bankrupt themselves buying luxury goods, many other monarchs tried to keep up with Louis and build their own mini Versailles, and they basically bankrupted their nations doing so. However, Matthew Prior was not impressed, and after the tour he was asked, probably with a tone of smug superiority, what he thought about the palace. And Prior said, "The monuments of my master's actions are to be found everywhere except in his own house." In other words, the French built a palace and the British built a navy. And so this story juxtaposes the national characters of England and France. So France was all in on these decadent signaling games, and the hard-working British just didn't even care about them. And Matthew Prior was proven correct, because shortly after this, the French and the English fought the War of Spanish Succession, and Louis XIV was forced to make major concessions to the British. And the reason why Matthew Prior was not impressed is because England was starting to reap the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. England was becoming a nation of free, prosperous, and hardworking people, and France was a nation of nobility and kings sucking the blood out of impoverished peasant farmers. And so the story of how England became industrialized and prosperous will be a running theme throughout the rest of this video series. The next video is going to be a deep dive into capitalist firms, and the reason why is that's really the group where we care about cooperation the most. So earlier in this video I used the example of 2,000 fishermen who had to collectively follow an informal quota, and 600 of them were on the sly violating their quota. And that problem generalizes to firms. What if you have a large firm with 20,000 employees and 6,000 of them are shirking on the job? So solving the problem of cooperation in groups is really the major barrier between societies with strong economies and societies with weak economies.